It was the summer of 1945, and Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on a work assignment. He worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and had spent 3 months in the city, far from his wife and young son, who were waiting for him in Nagasaki. On the morning of August 6th, he was already preparing to return home. The day began hot and humid, like so many others that summer, and Tsutomu was walking to the shipyard when he looked up at the sky and noticed a distant sound, different from what he was used to hearing. As he continued down the street, he heard the engine of a lone airplane cutting through the air. It wasn't uncommon to see aircraft flying over Japan at that time, but there was something different. The sky was clear, and the plane was flying too high to be part of a conventional attack. Suddenly, a white and intense flash, brighter than the sun, exploded before his eyes. He had no time to think. Instinct made him throw himself to the ground, covering his ears and closing his eyes. The heat came first, a heat so overwhelming it felt like his skin was burning alive. Then came the wind. A shockwave lifted him into the air like a rag doll, throwing him several meters away. He landed dazed, with a deafening ringing in his ears. When he opened his eyes, he saw that everything around him was shrouded in smoke, debris, and an eerie silence broken only by distant screams. Hiroshima had changed forever in an instant. It took him a few minutes to understand what had happened. The place where there had once been buildings and streets was now a charred wasteland. People wandered like shadows, with torn clothes, burned skin, and eyes glazed over in shock. Some called out for relatives, others simply walked in silence, as if they were no longer really there. Tsutomu realized that he, too, was injured. His face and arms were covered in burns, and his eardrum had ruptured. With great difficulty, he managed to crawl to an improvised shelter where other survivors were trying to understand what had hit them. There was no immediate aid. The entire city was in ruins. As the hours passed, the sky began to darken, not because of nightfall, but because of the smoke and dust spreading in the air. The rain that fell was black, mixed with ash and soot. Each drop felt like a cruel reminder that nature itself had been poisoned. The next day, even weak and in excruciating pain, Tsutomu knew he had to return to Nagasaki. He wanted to find his wife and son, perhaps before it was too late. Summoning what little strength he had left, he made his way to the station and managed to board an overcrowded train full of wounded people and survivors. As the landscape passed by the window, he saw scorched fields and silent villages, as if life had vanished from the land. When he arrived home, he was met with shock and relief. His wife could hardly believe he had survived. In the days that followed, he tried to rest and recover, though the pain and fever never subsided. Still, on August 9th, he decided to go to the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki to report what he had seen and warn his colleagues about the terrible weapon that had destroyed Hiroshima. He did not know that fate was about to repeat the horror. While speaking with his supervisor and some colleagues, at around 11 in the morning, another intense flash lit up the room. Once again, Tsutomu felt the unbearable heat and the impact of the shockwave. Glass shattered, walls collapsed, and the air filled with dust and smoke. He fell to the floor, stunned, unable to believe he was going through this again. 2 nuclear attacks in less than a week. The scene in Nagasaki was no different from what he had seen in Hiroshima. Burned people, buildings in flames, screams echoing through the streets. Tsutomu managed to return home, where he found his wife and son unharmed, a miracle, considering their house was relatively close to the epicenter of the explosion. With few words, he embraced them and decided he would not leave again. The city was in ruins, but at least they were together. In the days that followed, the family survived on little food and water while helping injured neighbors as best they could. Tsutomu felt his body growing weaker by the day. His burns were beginning to become infected, and the fever was constant. He didn't know he was suffering from radiation sickness, something poorly understood at the time. Even so, he endured, sustained by the will to protect his family and by the simple fact that he had already survived the impossible twice. The days after the second explosion were a silent struggle against death. Tsutomu remembered little of the details. His mind seemed clouded, as if part of it had shut down to avoid facing reality. He saw neighbors suddenly drop dead, others suffering from inexplicable bleeding. Radiation was taking lives slowly and cruelly, but no one yet understood exactly what this mysterious illness was that left the skin pale, the body weak and hair falling out. Despite his injuries, Tsutomu did not give up. With his wife's help, he cleaned his burns daily, using clean cloths and the little water they had. There were no medicines, no doctors enough to care for everyone. Each passing day was a silent victory. He believed that if he could survive just a few more weeks, he might have a real chance at living, though. Inside, he carried the trauma of having seen 2 cities reduced to ashes. Months passed, and against all odds, Tsutomu recovered enough to return to work. But now, his life had a different meaning. He had witnessed the greatest weapon of destruction ever used against human beings, not once, but twice. He could not allow it to be forgotten. He began telling his story to neighbors, colleagues, and anyone willing to listen, even when many did not believe that someone could survive 2 nuclear attacks. For years, Tsutomu lived in relative peace, but the memory of the explosions never left him. At night he dreamed of the flash, of the heat burning his skin, of the smell of smoke and flesh in the air. Every anniversary of the bombings he would withdraw into silence. He knew the story needed to be told, but also carried the burden of reliving it each time he spoke. It was only decades later, already an old man, that Tsutomu began to be more actively involved in campaigns against the use of nuclear weapons. He became a recognized hibakusha, the Japanese term for survivors of the atomic bombs, and traveled to give lectures, interviews, and testimonies. His goal was simple: to ensure the world knew the horror those weapons could cause, and that no one else would go through what he had lived. In 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized Tsutomu as the only known person to have survived both explosions. This recognition not only validated his story, but also carried symbolic weight. He was, literally, the living testimony of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The news spread around the world, and Tsutomu began to be sought after by journalists and documentary filmmakers from various countries. Even at an advanced age, he continued granting interviews and attending events, always repeating the same message: atomic bombs must never be used again. For him, this was not just a slogan but a conclusion drawn from pain and loss. His words carried an authority that only someone who had survived the impossible could have. In January 2010, at the age of 93, Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away in Nagasaki, surrounded by his family. His life was, at the same time, a miracle and a grim reminder of what humanity is capable of doing to itself. Until the end, he believed that telling his story was his responsibility to those who could not survive. Today, Tsutomu's name is remembered, not only as the man who survived 2 atomic bombs, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. His story continues to be told in books, documentaries, and history classes. And perhaps, each time someone hears his account, the world takes a small step closer to the promise he so strongly defended: never again allow such destruction to happen. Tsutomu's life teaches us that even in the most unimaginable moments of pain and loss, there is the possibility of moving forward. His survival was a miracle, but his courage in turning that tragedy into a warning for the world was a choice that still echoes today, reminding everyone that some stories must be told so they never happen again.